Welcome to Truth Unveiled. I'm Emma, and this is the story of how my sister thought she destroyed my future in one night, until she discovered exactly who had been protecting her from the consequences of her choices for years. At 4 in the morning on what should have been just another peaceful Tuesday, my phone rang with the kind of urgency that makes your heart stop. My sister Jessica was sobbing on the other end, claiming there had been a break-in at my apartment while I was staying at my fiancé David's place. She insisted she needed to meet me there immediately, that something terrible had happened and she was the only one who could help me figure out what was missing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known something was wrong the moment Jessica volunteered to help with anything. My younger sister had perfected the art of creating chaos while positioning herself as the victim, and our parents had spent 26 years enabling every destructive choice she made. But at 4 in the morning, with wedding planning stress already consuming my thoughts, I wasn't thinking clearly. Jessica had always been the tornado in our family's otherwise calm existence. While I spent my teenage years working part-time jobs and saving every penny for college, she was maxing out credit cards our parents cosigned for, claiming she needed the money for emergencies that always seemed to involve expensive clothes or weekend trips with friends she barely knew. When I graduated summa cum laude and landed my dream job at a tech startup in Portland, Jessica was dropping out of her third college program, insisting that traditional education wasn't designed for creative minds like hers. The pattern had been consistent for years. Jessica would create a crisis, our parents would panic and throw money at the problem, and I would be expected to understand why family always comes first, even when that family member showed no intention of growing up or taking responsibility for their choices. When she totaled her car driving under the influence, I was asked to help with the legal fees because she was young and deserved a second chance. When she lost her apartment for not paying rent despite having a full-time job, I was guilt-tripped into co-signing for a new place because family doesn't abandon family. The worst part wasn't Jessica's behavior itself, it was watching our parents' faces every time she disappointed them, and then watching them turn to me with that familiar expression that said I was the reliable one, the one who would always be there to clean up the mess. I had become the family's insurance policy against Jessica's poor decisions, and somewhere along the way, I had accepted that role without realizing how much it was costing me. But this morning was different. As I rushed through the empty Portland streets, my wedding dress safely hanging in my bedroom closet and my savings account containing 2 years' worth of careful budgeting for the perfect wedding, I had no idea that Jessica had already been inside my apartment for hours. I didn't know that she had discovered the envelope I kept in my bedroom drawer, the one containing the cash I had been setting aside for final wedding expenses, money I had been saving in small bills, because it felt more real that way, more like the dream I was building $1 at a time. When I arrived at my downtown loft, Jessica was waiting outside the building, pacing back and forth in the parking garage with an expression I had seen countless times before. It was the look she wore when she was about to ask for something she knew she didn't deserve, the combination of defiance and desperation that usually preceded a request for money or a favor that would somehow become my responsibility to fix when it inevitably went wrong. She rushed toward me as I got out of my car, her words tumbling over each other in a rehearsed panic that should have been my first warning sign. She claimed she had been driving by my building around midnight when she noticed my apartment door was slightly open, and being the concerned sister she was, she had gone up to investigate. According to her story, she had found evidence that someone had been inside, rifling through my belongings, and she had been waiting outside ever since, too scared to go back in alone but too worried about me to leave. The story sounded plausible enough in my sleep-deprived state, and Jessica had always been a convincing liar when she needed to be. She had perfected the art of mixing just enough truth into her deceptions to make them believable, and she knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to get people to stop asking difficult questions. As we walked up to my apartment together, she kept emphasizing how terrible she felt that this had happened, how she couldn't believe someone would violate my space like this, and how she was going to do everything in her power to help me figure out what was missing. The moment I opened my apartment door, I knew something was wrong, but it wasn't what Jessica had led me to expect. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing seemed out of place, and there were no signs of forced entry or random vandalism that would indicate a break-in by strangers. Instead, there was something almost surgical about whatever had happened here, as if someone who knew exactly what they were looking for had gone directly to specific locations without wasting time on anything else. Jessica guided me toward my bedroom, her hand on my elbow in a gesture that felt more controlling than comforting, and kept talking about how sorry she was that this had happened, how she knew how much stress I was already under with wedding planning, and how she wished there was something she could do to make this easier for me. Her words felt like a script she had been rehearsing, and when we reached my bedroom doorway, I understood why. My wedding dress, the one I had spent months searching for, and had finally found at a small boutique in downtown Portland, was hanging from my closet door in pieces. Someone had taken scissors to the delicate lace sleeves, cut through the bodice in jagged lines, and reduced the flowing skirt to ribbons of fabric that barely resembled the gown I had fallen in love with. But even in my shock, I noticed that the cuts were precise, almost methodical, as if whoever had done this had taken their time and enjoyed the process of destruction. As I stood frozen in my bedroom doorway, staring at the remains of what was supposed to be the centerpiece of the most important day of my life, Jessica moved past me toward my dresser and opened the drawer where I kept important documents. She made a show of checking whether anything was missing from my jewelry box, rifling through papers as if she was helping me take inventory, but I caught something in her expression when she looked toward the spot where I kept my wedding cash envelope. That's when the pieces started falling into place. Jessica knew about the envelope because I had mentioned it to our parents during a family dinner, talking about how satisfying it felt to save money in cash and watch the stack of bills grow thicker each month. She knew I kept it in my bedroom drawer because she had been
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
in my apartment countless times, often when I wasn't home, usually with some excuse about needing to borrow something or wanting to surprise me by cleaning up as a favor. Most importantly, she knew exactly how much money was in that envelope because I had been excited about reaching my goal and had told the family that I finally had enough saved to cover all the remaining wedding expenses without having to put anything on credit cards. $40,000 in small bills, representing 2 years of skipped dinners out, canceled weekend trips, and careful budgeting that had become a source of pride for me. Jessica was still making noise about checking for missing items when I walked to my dresser and opened the drawer where the envelope should have been. The space was empty, but not randomly empty. Everything else was exactly where I had left it, organized and untouched, as if someone had reached in with surgical precision and removed only one specific item. I turned to look at Jessica, who was now standing by my bedroom window with her back to me, talking about how she was going to call the police and how we needed to make a list of everything that was gone so we could file a proper report. But her voice had changed, becoming higher and more rushed, and she was avoiding eye contact in a way that reminded me of when we were children and she had been caught in a lie but was still trying to maintain the story. The realization hit me like a physical blow, not just because of what she had done, but because of how long she must have been planning this. Jessica hadn't stumbled upon an opportunity to steal from me. She had created the opportunity probably weeks ago and had been waiting for the right moment to execute her plan. The break-in story was her cover, designed to position herself as my ally and support system while I dealt with the trauma of being robbed by strangers. I sat down on my bed, looking at the destroyed dress and the empty drawer, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just theft or vandalism, this was a deliberate attempt to destroy the life I had been building, carried out by someone who knew exactly how much damage they were inflicting and had chosen to do it anyway. Jessica hadn't just stolen my money. She had stolen my sense of safety, my trust in family, and my ability to have the wedding I had been dreaming about for 2 years. But as I sat there in the wreckage of my bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of my sister's betrayal, I realized that Jessica had made a critical miscalculation. She had assumed that I would react the way I always had to her crises, by quietly absorbing the damage and finding a way to move forward without making waves. She expected me to be devastated and helpless, maybe even grateful for her support during this difficult time. What Jessica didn't know was that the envelope in my drawer hadn't contained all of my wedding money. It had contained the cash I kept on hand for vendors who preferred immediate payment, but the bulk of my savings was in a separate account that she knew nothing about. More importantly, she had no idea that I had been documenting her behavior for months, keeping records of every suspicious incident and every request for money that our parents had pressured me into fulfilling. Jessica was still talking about calling the police when I stood up and walked to my laptop. I opened the folder where I kept digital copies of all my important documents, including the security system information that Jessica didn't know existed in my building. The cameras in the hallway and parking garage had been recording all night, and the timestamp on the footage would show exactly when Jessica had entered my apartment and how long she had been here before calling me. I also opened the spreadsheet where I had been tracking Jessica's financial requests over the past 3 years, along with screenshots of her social media posts showing expensive purchases that coincided with family emergencies, and copies of text messages where she had bragged to friends about manipulating our parents into covering her expenses. I had started keeping these records after the third time our parents asked me to help with one of Jessica's crises, not because I planned to use them against her, but because I needed to understand the pattern of behavior that was affecting our entire family. Now, looking at 2 years' worth of documentation while sitting in my destroyed bedroom, I realized that Jessica had just provided me with the final piece of evidence I needed to show our parents exactly what kind of person they had been enabling. She had crossed a line that even they wouldn't be able to rationalize away, and she had done it in a way that would be impossible for her to deny or minimize. Jessica was growing more agitated as I worked on my laptop, asking what I was doing, and insisting that we needed to focus on reporting the break-in to the police. She kept emphasizing how important it was to act quickly, how the longer we waited the harder it would be to track down the criminals who had done this to me, and how she was going to do everything in her power to help me get through this trauma. But I was no longer listening to her performance. Instead, I was methodically gathering evidence and preparing for a conversation that was long overdue, not just with Jessica, but with our parents who had spent years refusing to acknowledge what their favoritism and enabling had created. I was tired of being the family's safety net, tired of watching Jessica hurt people without consequences, and tired of pretending that family loyalty meant accepting abuse from someone who had never shown any loyalty in return. When I finished collecting the evidence I needed, I closed my laptop and looked at Jessica for the first time since discovering the empty drawer. She was still maintaining her concerned sister act, but I could see the panic starting to creep into her expression as she realized that I wasn't reacting the way she had expected. I wasn't crying or frantically calling our parents for help. I wasn't asking her what I should do or expressing gratitude for her support during this crisis. Instead, I was calm in a way that seemed to unnerve her, and I could see her mentally scrambling to figure out why her carefully planned deception wasn't working the way it was supposed to. Jessica had built her entire adult life around the assumption that other people would always clean up her messes, and she had never developed a backup plan for situations where that assumption turned out to be wrong. I stood up slowly, walked to my closet, and carefully gathered the pieces of my destroyed wedding dress. The fabric was still beautiful despite the damage, and as I held the remnants in my hands, I found myself thinking about all the hours I had spent dreaming about walking down the aisle in this gown, all the conversations with my fiancé about what our wedding day would look like, and all the sacrifices I had made to save enough money to make those dreams come true. Jessica was watching me with growing anxiety, and I could see her trying to figure out what I was thinking and how she should respond. She had always been good at reading people's emotions and adjusting her approach accordingly, but my calmness was apparently outside her range of experience. She started talking faster, returning to her story about the break-in and suggesting specific steps we should take to report the crime and begin the process of recovery. That's when I looked directly at her and said the words that would change everything between us forever. I told her that I knew she had stolen my money and destroyed my dress, that I had evidence to prove it, and that her performance as the concerned sister was over. I explained that I had security footage, financial records, and documentation of her behavior patterns, and that I was no longer willing to participate in the family dynamic that had enabled her destructive choices for so many years. The look on Jessica's face when she realized that her plan had failed was something I will never forget. It was the expression of someone who had always been able to manipulate situations to her advantage, discovering that the rules of the game had suddenly changed, and that she was no longer playing against someone who would let her win rather than deal with the consequences of her losing. Wedding Fund Revenge Story Parts 2, 5. Jessica's denial came swift and fierce, exactly as I had expected it would. She raised her voice to a pitch that would have sent our parents rushing to comfort her, insisting that I was accusing her of something unthinkable, that she was hurt and shocked that I would even suggest she was capable of such betrayal. Her eyes filled with tears that looked real enough, and she began pacing around my bedroom with the kind of frantic energy that had always signaled the beginning of one of her dramatic performances. She demanded to know how I could think such terrible things about my own sister, especially when she had been the one to discover the crime and call me immediately. Jessica reminded me of all the times she had been there for me, conveniently forgetting that most of those instances had involved her creating problems that required my help to solve. She spoke about family loyalty and how devastated our parents would be to know that I was turning against her during what should be a time of mutual support and healing. The performance was masterful, and I found myself almost admiring the skill with which she wove together genuine emotion, manufactured outrage, and strategic manipulation. If I hadn't already seen the patterns so many times before, if I didn't have concrete evidence of what had actually happened, her reaction might have been convincing enough to make me doubt my own perceptions and apologize for my accusations. But something had fundamentally shifted in my willingness to participate in Jessica's version of reality. Standing in my destroyed bedroom, holding pieces of my wedding dress while listening to her protest her innocence, I felt a clarity that had been missing from our relationship for years. I was no longer seeing Jessica through the lens of family obligation or sibling loyalty. I was seeing her as she actually was, and what I saw was someone who had built her entire adult identity around the assumption that other people would always absorb the consequences of her choices. I set the dress pieces down carefully on my bed and walked back to my laptop. Without saying anything, I opened the security footage from my building's hallway camera and turned the screen so Jessica could see it clearly. The timestamp showed her entering my apartment at 12:30 in the morning, nearly 4 hours before she called me with her story about discovering a break-in. The footage was crystal clear, showing her using the spare key I had given her for emergencies, looking around carefully to make sure no one was watching, and entering my apartment with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what they were planning to do. Jessica's reaction to seeing herself on camera was immediate and telling. Her tears stopped abruptly, replaced by a look of cold calculation that was far more honest than anything she had shown me since I arrived. For a moment the mask slipped completely, and I saw the person she really was underneath all the manufactured vulnerability and practiced helplessness. She was angry, not remorseful, and her anger was directed at me for having the audacity to gather evidence rather than simply accepting whatever story she chose to tell. She tried to recover quickly, claiming that the footage proved nothing except that she had been checking on my apartment out of concern for my safety. Jessica insisted that she had noticed something suspicious earlier in the evening and had come by to investigate, discovering the break-in and immediately calling me. The story was creative, but it fell apart under the weight of basic logic. The security footage showed her leaving my apartment just 10 minutes before she called me, and her demeanor on camera was calm and purposeful, nothing like someone who had just discovered evidence of a crime. More damaging was what the footage didn't show. There were no other people entering or leaving my apartment that night, no signs of forced entry, no indication of any kind of disturbance before Jessica's arrival. The cameras covered every angle of the hallway and the building's main entrance, and the complete record of the night's activity made it impossible for her to maintain her story about discovering someone else's crime. I pulled up the financial tracking spreadsheet I had been maintaining and showed Jessica the pattern of her requests for money that coincided with her social media posts about expensive purchases. The documentation went back 3 years and painted a clear picture of someone who had been systematically manipulating family members to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. Each crisis that had required emergency financial assistance from our parents was followed within days by photos of Jessica at expensive restaurants, wearing new clothes, or taking trips that should have been impossible on her stated income. The most damaging evidence was a text message thread I had screenshot between Jessica and one of her friends, where she had bragged about her ability to get money from our parents by creating emergencies they felt compelled to solve. In one particularly revealing exchange, she had described me as the family's automatic backup plan, someone who could always be counted on to contribute to whatever financial crisis she manufactured because I was too guilty about my own success to say no when family members needed help. Jessica's facade crumbled completely as she realized the extent of the evidence I had gathered. The tears and protestations of innocence were replaced by a cold fury that was much more authentic than anything she had shown me earlier. She accused me of spying on her, of collecting information like some kind of paranoid detective, and of betraying family trust by documenting private conversations and personal moments. Her anger revealed the entitled mindset that had been driving her behavior for years. Jessica genuinely believed that she was entitled to take whatever she needed from family members, and that my documentation of her pattern of theft and manipulation was a greater betrayal than the theft itself. In her worldview, I was supposed to accept being victimized silently, and my refusal to play that role was a violation of the unspoken family contract that had protected her from consequences for so long. I watched her rage with a detachment that surprised me. Where I once would have felt guilty for upsetting her, now I felt only a kind of relief that the pretense was finally over. Jessica was showing me exactly who she was, and for the first time in years, I was allowing myself to see it clearly, instead of making excuses or trying to find ways to understand her perspective. The transformation in her demeanor was complete now. Gone was the concerned sister who had called me in distress, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shocked that I had refused to participate in my own victimization. Jessica demanded to know what I thought I was going to do with my supposed evidence, speaking as if my documentation of her crimes was somehow more problematic than the crimes themselves. I closed my laptop and looked at her directly, feeling calmer than I had in months despite the chaos surrounding us. I told her that I was done protecting her from the consequences of her choices, done pretending that family loyalty meant accepting abuse, and done participating in a dynamic that had turned me into an enabler of her destructive behavior. Jessica's response was swift and vicious. She told me that I had always been jealous of her, that my success in my career was meaningless because I had no real relationships or genuine happiness in my life. She claimed that David was only marrying me because I was financially stable, and that once he discovered how controlling and vindictive I really was, he would realize his mistake and leave me for someone more fun and spontaneous. The personal attacks were designed to hurt me in ways that Jessica knew I was vulnerable, targeting my insecurities about whether I was too focused on responsibility and achievement to be truly lovable. In the past, these kinds of statements would have devastated me, confirming fears I carried about whether my careful approach to life made me somehow less worthy of love than people who lived more impulsively. But sitting in my destroyed bedroom, looking at evidence of how much damage Jessica's impulsiveness had caused, I found that her words couldn't touch me the way they once would have. I realized that the life I had built through careful planning and hard work was exactly the life I wanted, and that the people who truly mattered to me valued those qualities rather than seeing them as flaws. Jessica seemed to sense that her usual tactics weren't working, and her attacks became more desperate. She threatened to tell our parents that I had falsely accused her of theft, that I had manufactured evidence to frame her for crimes she didn't commit, and that my obsession with control had finally pushed me into complete paranoia. She promised that our entire family would turn against me once they learned how I had treated her during her time of need. The threats might have been effective if I hadn't already made a decision about what needed to happen next. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had been avoiding for weeks, knowing that the conversation it would trigger would change our family dynamics permanently. But Jessica's theft had forced a confrontation that was long overdue, and I was no longer willing to protect her from accountability in order to preserve family peace. Our parents answered on the second ring, and I could hear the worry in their voices as they asked if everything was okay. It was 6 in the morning, and emergency calls at that hour usually meant serious problems that required immediate attention. I told them that I needed them to come to my apartment right away, that something had happened that we needed to discuss as a family, and that Jessica was already here with me. Jessica's face went white as she realized what I was doing. She grabbed for my phone, trying to end the call before I could say anything else, but I moved away from her and continued speaking to our parents. I told them to bring their bank statements from the past year, along with any documentation they had of the money they had given Jessica for various emergencies. I explained that there had been an incident involving stolen money and property damage, and that we needed to have a complete and honest conversation about what had been happening in our family. The drive from our parents' house in Beaverton to my downtown Portland apartment would take about 30 minutes in early morning traffic, giving Jessica and me time for a final conversation before the family meeting that would determine what happened next. Jessica spent the first few minutes trying to convince me to call our parents back and cancel the meeting, promising that she would find a way to return the money if I would just give her time to figure out a solution. Her promises rang hollow because we both knew she didn't have $40,000 to return, and even if she could somehow access that much money, the damage to my wedding dress couldn't be undone. More importantly, I had finally accepted that Jessica's pattern of behavior wouldn't change as long as family members continued to shield her from consequences. The meeting with our parents wasn't just about recovering my stolen money. It was about forcing everyone to confront the reality of who Jessica had become and what continuing to enable her was costing the rest of us. Jessica tried a different approach, appealing to my sense of family loyalty and asking me to consider what this confrontation would do to our parents. She painted a picture of two older people who had already sacrificed so much for their children, who didn't deserve to have their family torn apart by conflict and accusations. She reminded me of all the times our parents had supported me, all the ways they had shown their love and pride in my accomplishments, and asked whether I really wanted to hurt them by forcing them to choose between their daughters. The manipulation was sophisticated because it contained elements of truth that made it difficult to dismiss entirely. Our parents were good people who had worked hard to provide for their children, and who genuinely wanted both Jessica and me to be happy and successful. They had made mistakes in how they handled Jessica's behavior, but those mistakes came from love and hope rather than malice or indifference. But I had finally understood that protecting our parents from the truth about Jessica wasn't actually protecting them at all. It was enabling a situation that was causing ongoing damage to everyone involved, including Jessica herself. Our parents
Had been pouring money into emergencies that weren't real, sacrificing their own financial security to support a daughter who was using their love against them. They deserved to know the truth about where their money was going and what their help was actually accomplishing. Jessica's final attempt to avoid accountability involved threatening to hurt herself if I went through with exposing her behavior to our parents. She claimed that the shame and rejection would be more than she could handle, and that I would be responsible for whatever happened to her if the family meeting destroyed her relationship with our parents. The threat was designed to trigger my protective instincts and make me feel responsible for her well-being in a way that would override my commitment to holding her accountable for her actions. I recognized the threat as another form of manipulation, one that Jessica had used successfully in the past to avoid consequences for her behavior. Our parents had repeatedly backed down from necessary confrontations because Jessica would threaten self-harm whenever she faced serious accountability. The pattern had taught her that she could always escalate her way out of trouble by making other people feel responsible for her emotional state. But I was no longer willing to be held hostage by threats that were designed to prioritize Jessica's comfort over everyone else's well-being. I told her that if she was genuinely struggling with thoughts of self-harm, I would be happy to help her connect with professional resources, but that I wouldn't allow those threats to prevent necessary conversations about her behavior. The honesty seemed to surprise Jessica, who had apparently expected her threat to end the confrontation immediately. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process the reality that her usual toolkit of manipulation tactics was no longer effective. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was facing a situation where she couldn't control the outcome by managing other people's emotions. When our parents knocked on my apartment door exactly 32 minutes after I called them, Jessica made one last desperate attempt to control the narrative. She positioned herself as the victim who had discovered a crime against her sister, emphasizing her shock and devastation at my accusations, and framing the upcoming conversation as evidence of my paranoid breakdown, rather than her criminal behavior. I opened the door to find our parents looking exactly as worried and confused as I had expected them to be. They had clearly rushed to get dressed and drive across town, and their faces showed the kind of concerned exhaustion that comes from years of dealing with family crises that never seem to have clear solutions. They looked from Jessica to me, trying to understand what kind of emergency had required their immediate presence at 6 in the morning. I invited them to sit down in my living room and offered to make coffee, but they were too anxious to focus on normal social courtesies. Our father asked directly what had happened, while our mother's eyes were already scanning the apartment for signs of whatever crisis had prompted my call. I could see them both trying to prepare themselves for whatever bad news I was about to share, their bodies tense with the anticipation of learning about another family emergency that would require their intervention. I had prepared for this moment throughout the 30 minutes while we waited for them to arrive, thinking carefully about how to present the information in a way that would be clear and factual rather than emotional or accusatory. I knew that our parents' initial instinct would be to protect Jessica and find ways to minimize the severity of what she had done, so I needed to present evidence that couldn't be rationalized away or explained through alternative interpretations. I started by showing them the security footage of Jessica entering my apartment in the middle of the night, explaining the timeline that proved her story about discovering a break-in was false. Then I showed them my destroyed wedding dress, carefully laying out the pieces so they could see the deliberate nature of the damage. Finally, I revealed the empty drawer where my wedding fund had been kept, explaining how much money had been taken and how long I had been saving to accumulate that amount. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but our parents' initial reaction was exactly what I had expected it would be. They looked to Jessica for an explanation, clearly hoping that there was some misunderstanding that could resolve the apparent contradiction between what they were seeing and their fundamental beliefs about their daughter's character. Jessica rose to the occasion with a performance that was both desperate and skillful. She acknowledged being in my apartment during the night, but claimed that she had been acting on a tip from one of her friends about suspicious activity in my building. According to her news story, she had come to investigate and had discovered that someone had already been in my apartment, finding my dress destroyed and my money missing. She claimed that she had been too traumatized by the discovery to call me immediately, spending hours trying to process what had happened before finally reaching out for help. The story was creative and showed Jessica's ability to adapt her lies to incorporate new evidence, but it still contained the same logical flaws that had made her original story unbelievable. Our parents wanted to believe her explanation, but they were struggling to reconcile her claims with the clear evidence of her presence in my apartment and the lack of any other suspects. I waited patiently while Jessica spun her revised narrative, then methodically dismantled it by walking through the timeline and showing how her story didn't match the physical evidence. I explained how the security cameras had captured every person who entered or left the building that night, how there were no signs of forced entry or random vandalism, and how the precision of the damage to my dress suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Our mother's face showed the moment when she began to accept the reality of what Jessica had done. It was a gradual process, visible in the way her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to a kind of heartbroken understanding. She had spent years making excuses for Jessica's behavior, finding ways to explain away evidence that suggested deeper problems. But the theft of my wedding fund and the destruction of my dress were acts of cruelty that couldn't be rationalized as mistakes or misunderstandings. Our father took longer to process the truth, cycling through anger, denial, and desperate attempts to find alternative explanations for what had happened. He asked Jessica directly whether she had taken my money, giving her opportunities to confess and begin the process of making things right. But Jessica maintained her innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence, doubling down on her victim narrative and accusing me of orchestrating an elaborate frame job designed to destroy her reputation. The confrontation stretched on for nearly 2 hours, with our parents gradually coming to terms with evidence they could no longer ignore or explain away. Jessica's responses became increasingly erratic, as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working, cycling between tearful pleas for understanding, angry accusations against me, and desperate attempts to redirect attention toward my supposed mental health problems. Finally, our father asked the question that cut through all of Jessica's deflections and evasions. He wanted to know where the $40,000 was now, and what she had done with money that was meant to pay for my wedding. The directness of the question seemed to break something in Jessica's resolve, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she had no immediate response. The silence stretched out uncomfortably, as everyone waited for Jessica to provide an answer that we all knew she couldn't give. She couldn't return money she had already spent, couldn't undo damage she had deliberately caused, and couldn't explain away evidence that clearly showed her guilt. The foundation of lies and manipulation that had supported her lifestyle for years was finally crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. When Jessica finally spoke, it was not to confess or apologize, but to launch a final vicious attack designed to hurt me in ways that had nothing to do with the theft itself. She told our parents that I had always been cold and calculating, that my success in my career had made me arrogant and cruel, and that my accusations against her were motivated by jealousy over the love and attention our parents had always shown her. She claimed that I had been planning this confrontation for months, gathering evidence and building a case against her because I resented having a sister who was more spontaneous and fun than I was. According to Jessica, my careful documentation of her behavior was proof of an obsessive personality that made me unsuitable for marriage, and she predicted that David would eventually realize his mistake and leave me for someone more emotionally healthy. The personal attacks were Jessica's final attempt to avoid accountability by making me the villain in a story where she was the victim of my vindictive plotting. But our parents had seen the evidence for themselves, and Jessica's attempts to redirect blame only served to highlight the manipulative thinking that had driven her to steal from me in the first place. I remained calm throughout Jessica's attack, recognizing it as a last desperate attempt to regain control of a situation that had moved beyond her ability to manipulate. When she finished speaking, I simply pulled out my phone and showed our parents the text message thread where Jessica had bragged to her friends about her ability to get money from them by manufacturing emergencies. The messages were devastating because they showed Jessica's true attitude toward our family, revealing that she saw our parents' love and concern as vulnerabilities to be exploited rather than gifts to be treasured. In her own words, she had described our father as someone who couldn't resist helping a daughter in distress, and our mother as someone whose guilt over past mistakes made her easy to manipulate into providing financial support. Reading those messages was the final blow to our parents' ability to maintain their illusions about Jessica's character. They had spent years believing that her requests for help were legitimate crises faced by a daughter who was struggling but trying her best. Learning that those crises were manufactured specifically to extract money from them was a betrayal that cut deeper than the theft of my wedding fund. Our mother began crying quietly, not the dramatic tears that usually accompanied family confrontations, but the kind of deep, silent weeping that comes from having fundamental beliefs about reality shattered beyond repair. Our father's face went through a series of expressions, settling finally on a look of grim determination that I had rarely seen from him. Jessica seemed to realize that her situation had become truly desperate. She began making promises about paying back the money, about getting help for her problems, about changing her behavior and rebuilding trust with the family. But her promises sounded hollow because we all knew she had made similar commitments before, usually in response to previous crises that had required family intervention. More importantly, the scale of what she had done made it impossible to treat this as just another mistake that could be forgiven and forgotten. Stealing $40,000 and destroying my wedding dress weren't impulsive errors in judgment. They were calculated acts of cruelty that required planning and deliberate choice-making at every step. I looked around the room at my family, seeing clearly for the first time how much damage Jessica's behavior had caused all of us. Our parents looked older than their years, worn down by the stress of constantly managing crises and providing financial support they couldn't afford. They had sacrificed their own dreams and security to enable a daughter who had never shown genuine appreciation for their help or made meaningful efforts to become self-sufficient. The moment had come for me to reveal the final piece of information that would determine what happened next. Throughout this entire confrontation, I had been calm and measured, presenting evidence and responding to Jessica's attacks without losing my composure. But now it was time to show my family that I was no longer willing to participate in a dynamic that had turned all of us into enablers of Jessica's destructive behavior. I opened my laptop one more time and pulled up the comprehensive financial analysis I had prepared, showing exactly how much money our parents had given Jessica over the past 3 years. The total was staggering, representing a significant portion of their retirement savings and discretionary income. I had documentation for every emergency that had required their financial intervention, along with evidence that most of those emergencies had been manufactured or significantly exaggerated. But the most important information I shared wasn't about Jessica's past behavior. It was about the decision I had made regarding her future. I told my family that I had already contacted the police and filed a report about the theft, providing them with copies of all the evidence I had gathered. I explained that I had also contacted my insurance company about the destroyed wedding dress, and that I was pursuing every legal avenue available to recover my losses and hold Jessica accountable for her crimes. The announcement that I had involved law enforcement transformed the atmosphere in the room completely. Until that moment, everything had felt like a family dispute that could potentially be resolved through internal negotiation and compromise. But my decision to file criminal charges meant that Jessica would face consequences that were completely outside our family's ability to control or mitigate. Jessica's reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused me of destroying our family, of choosing revenge over reconciliation, and of prioritizing money over my relationship with my sister. She told our parents that my vindictive response proved that I had never really loved her, and that my willingness to involve strangers in family business showed how cold and calculating I had become. But I had already made peace with the necessity of this choice. Jessica had spent years counting on family loyalty to protect her from accountability, and that protection had enabled increasingly destructive behavior that was hurting everyone who cared about her. The only way to break the cycle was to remove the family's ability to shield her from consequences, forcing her to face the reality of what her choices had cost other people. Our parents struggled to process this new development, clearly torn between their protective instincts toward Jessica and their growing understanding of how much damage her behavior had caused. They asked whether there was still time to resolve things privately, whether Jessica's promise to make restitution might be enough to avoid involving the legal system in what they still wanted to see as a family matter. I explained gently but firmly that the time for private resolution had passed when Jessica chose to steal my wedding fund and destroy my dress. Those actions had consequences that extended beyond family relationships, affecting my ability to have the wedding I had planned and potentially damaging my credit and financial stability. I told them that I loved Jessica and hoped she would eventually get the help she needed, but that I could no longer prioritize protecting her over protecting myself and my future with David. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at my apartment door, and I realized that the police officers I had contacted earlier were arriving to take Jessica's statement about the theft. I had timed their arrival carefully, wanting to have the family conversation first, but knowing that delaying official involvement would only give Jessica more opportunities to destroy evidence or create additional complications. Jessica looked panic-stricken as she realized that her situation had moved beyond family negotiation into the realm of criminal justice. She begged our parents to do something, to find a way to stop me from pressing charges, to make this whole situation disappear before it damaged her future permanently. But our parents were beginning to understand that their years of intervention and protection had contributed to the crisis we were all facing. As I walked toward the door to let the police officers into my apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to family conflicts. I felt peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was responding to Jessica's destructive behavior by prioritizing my own well-being over family harmony, and the clarity of that choice was both liberating and profoundly sad. Wedding Fund Revenge Story, Part 6-9. The police officers who entered my apartment were professional and thorough, immediately establishing a calm authority that seemed to deflate Jessica's remaining attempts at manipulation. Officer Martinez was a veteran investigator who specialized in family financial crimes, while Officer Thompson handled the documentation and evidence collection. They had clearly dealt with similar situations before, and their matter-of-fact approach to Jessica's theft transformed what had felt like a family drama into a straightforward criminal investigation. Jessica's demeanor changed completely in the presence of law enforcement. Gone was the angry defiance she had shown during our family confrontation, replaced by a subdued compliance that our parents had probably never witnessed before. When Officer Martinez asked her to explain her presence in my apartment during the early morning hours, Jessica's voice became small and uncertain, lacking the confident manipulation she had displayed just minutes earlier. She attempted to maintain her story about investigating suspicious activity, but her explanation sounded increasingly hollow when delivered to trained investigators rather than family members who wanted to believe her. Officer Thompson asked specific questions about the timeline, the building's security procedures, and Jessica's knowledge of my financial arrangements, questions that exposed the logical inconsistencies in her version of events with surgical precision. The security footage spoke for itself, but the officers also examined the physical evidence with a thoroughness that made Jessica visibly uncomfortable. They photographed the destroyed wedding dress from multiple angles, documenting the precision of the cuts and the deliberate nature of the damage. Officer Martinez noted that the destruction pattern suggested someone who had taken time to inflict maximum psychological damage rather than someone who had acted impulsively or in anger. When they examined my bedroom, the officers pointed out details that I had missed in my initial shock. The way my drawers had been searched showed someone who knew exactly what they were looking for, with personal items carefully moved aside rather than scattered randomly. The absence of any attempt to steal jewelry, electronics, or other valuable items that would be obvious targets for typical burglars further supported the conclusion that this had been a targeted theft by someone with specific knowledge of my habits and possessions. Our parents watched the investigation unfold with expressions of growing devastation. Seeing their daughter's behavior analyzed through the lens of criminal law enforcement stripped away any remaining ability to view her actions as family mistakes, rather than deliberate crimes. The officers' professional terminology and methodical evidence collection transformed Jessica from their troubled daughter into a criminal suspect, a shift in perspective that was clearly painful but necessary. Jessica made one final attempt to control the narrative by requesting a private conversation with our parents, claiming that there were family circumstances the officers didn't understand that would explain her behavior. But Officer Martinez explained that the evidence of theft and property destruction was clear regardless of family dynamics, and that Jessica's motivations wouldn't change the criminal nature of her actions. The moment when Jessica was formally arrested was surreal in its quiet efficiency. Officer Thompson read her rights, while Officer Martinez completed the paperwork, both of them treating the situation as routine business rather than the family catastrophe it felt like to the rest of us. Jessica's face showed a kind of shocked disbelief, as if she had never seriously considered that her actions might lead to actual legal consequences. Our mother tried to intervene, asking the officers whether there was some way to resolve the situation without formal charges, explaining that Jessica had been struggling with personal problems and didn't deserve to have her entire future destroyed by one mistake. But Officer Martinez gently explained that the decision to press charges was mine to make, and that the evidence clearly supported criminal prosecution regardless of Jessica's personal circumstances. I watched my sister being led away in handcuffs with a mixture of relief and sadness that surprised me. Relief because I was finally free from the cycle of enabling and victimization that had defined our relationship for years. Sadness because this ending felt like the death of any possibility that Jessica might have chosen to change her behavior before it reached this point. She had been given countless opportunities to take responsibility for her actions, and she had chosen escalation over accountability every single time. After the officers left with Jessica, our parents and I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of what had just happened. The silence was heavy with unspoken questions about what would happen next, how our family would navigate the legal process, and whether there was any possibility of rebuilding relationships that had been so fundamentally damaged by years of deception and manipulation. Our father was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion as he apologized for the role he and our mother had played in enabling Jessica's behavior. He acknowledged that their desire to protect and support her had blinded them to the harm she was causing other people, including me. The apology was heartfelt, but also carried the weight of recognition that their good intentions had contributed to a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Our mother's apology was more personal, focused on the specific ways she had failed to protect me from Jessica's manipulation. She admitted that she had known about some of Jessica's lies, but had chosen to ignore them rather than confronting the painful reality of what her daughter had become. She expressed regret for all the time she had asked me to be understanding and patient with Jessica, not realizing that she was essentially asking me to enable destructive behavior that would eventually escalate to criminal activity. The conversations with my parents over the following hours were some of the most honest we had ever had as a family. Without Jessica's presence to deflect attention or redirect blame, we were able to discuss patterns of behavior that had been obvious but unspoken for years. Our parents began to understand how their financial support had funded Jessica's manipulation of other people, and how their emotional support had reinforced her belief that she could avoid consequences for her actions indefinitely. I shared with them the full extent of my documentation, showing them evidence of Jessica's behavior that went far beyond the immediate theft of my wedding fund. The pattern revealed someone who had been systematically exploiting family relationships for financial gain, using emotional manipulation to extract money that funded a lifestyle completely disconnected from her stated income or circumstances. Our parents were shocked to learn about the extent of Jessica's social media presence, where she had been documenting expensive purchases and luxury experiences that should have been impossible given her claimed financial struggles. The disconnect between her public image and her private requests for emergency financial assistance painted a clear picture of someone who had been living a double life for years. More disturbing was the evidence of how Jessica had been talking about our family to her friends, describing us as resources to be managed rather than people to be loved. Her casual references to manipulating our parents' emotions and exploiting my sense of family obligation showed a level of calculated manipulation that was difficult for people who loved her to accept or understand. The legal process moved forward with a efficiency that reflected the strength of the evidence against Jessica. The district attorney's office treated the case as a straightforward theft, complicated somewhat by the family relationship but not substantially changed by it. Jessica's public defender advised her to consider a plea agreement rather than going to trial, given the security footage and financial documentation that made her guilt virtually impossible to dispute. Jessica's initial response to her legal situation was entirely consistent with her historical pattern of behavior. She blamed me for being vindictive, blamed our parents for not supporting her adequately, and blamed the legal system for failing to understand the family dynamics that had led to her actions. At no point did she take responsibility for choosing to steal my money or destroy my wedding dress, instead positioning herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. The plea negotiations revealed the full extent of Jessica's financial situation, which was even worse than I had suspected. She had accumulated significant debt through credit cards and personal loans, had been evicted from multiple apartments for non-payment of rent, and had been borrowing money from friends and acquaintances with no realistic plan for repayment. The $40,000 she had stolen from me represented only a fraction of the money she owed to various creditors. Her criminal defense attorney painted a picture of someone who had been struggling with impulse control and financial management issues, suggesting that Jessica's crimes were the result of desperation rather than malice. But the evidence of planning and premeditation, combined with her documented history of manipulating family members for financial gain, made it difficult to characterize her actions as impulsive mistakes rather than calculated choices.
The victim impact statement I wrote for the court focused not just on the immediate financial and emotional damage Jessica had caused, but on the years of manipulation and exploitation that had led to this moment. I described the pattern of family crises that had required financial intervention, the emotional toll of constantly worrying about Jessica's well-being, while knowing that my help was enabling destructive behavior, and the violation of trust that came from discovering that someone I loved had been systematically deceiving and exploiting me. Writing that statement was both therapeutic and painful, requiring me to acknowledge the full extent of how Jessica's behavior had affected my life and relationships. I had spent years minimizing the impact of her actions, telling myself that family loyalty required accepting a certain amount of chaos and drama. Articulating the true cost of that tolerance helped me understand why setting boundaries had been so necessary, even though it felt cruel at the time. Jessica ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, community service, and probation, avoiding jail time, but creating a criminal record that would affect her employment and housing prospects for years to come. The restitution agreement required her to repay the $40,000 she had stolen, though her financial situation made it unclear whether she would ever be able to fulfill that obligation completely. The most significant consequence of the legal process wasn't the formal punishment Jessica received, but the way it forced our entire family to confront realities we had been avoiding for years. Our parents began attending counseling sessions designed to help family members of people with destructive behavior patterns, learning about codependency, and enabling in ways that were both enlightening and painful. For me, the legal resolution provided closure but also marked the beginning of a more complex emotional process. I had successfully held Jessica accountable for her crimes, but I still had to figure out how to move forward with my life while carrying the knowledge of what someone I loved had
been willing to do to me. The theft of my wedding fund had been devastating, but the destruction of my trust and family relationships felt even more significant. David's response to the entire situation was one of the things that helped me understand that Jessica's prediction about my relationship had been completely wrong. Instead of being frightened away by the family drama or concerned about my vindictive response to being victimized, he was impressed by my strength in refusing to accept abuse and my commitment to holding people accountable for their behavior regardless of family pressure. He helped me understand that the qualities Jessica had attacked as evidence of my unworthiness for love were actually the qualities that made me a good partner and a strong person. My careful planning, my documentation of problems, and my willingness to set boundaries were signs of emotional health rather than dysfunction. The fact that I had refused to enable Jessica's destructive behavior showed that I was capable of making difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience. The wedding planning process resumed with a different kind of energy than it had before the theft. Instead of the anxious excitement I had felt while trying to manage every detail perfectly, I found myself approaching the planning with a calmer confidence in what really mattered. The expensive dress that Jessica had destroyed was replaced with something simpler but more meaningful, chosen for how it made me feel rather than how it looked in photographs. More importantly, the guest list for our wedding was revised to reflect the new reality of our family relationships. Jessica would not be attending, obviously, but the decision about whether to include our parents was more complex. They had supported my decision to press charges and were working to understand their role in enabling Jessica's behavior, but the process of rebuilding trust would take time. The financial impact of Jessica's theft was significant but not devastating in the way she had probably intended it to be. The insurance settlement for my destroyed dress covered most of the replacement cost, and David and I adjusted our wedding budget to accommodate the loss of the stolen money. We had been planning a celebration that was somewhat beyond our natural preferences anyway, and the forced simplification actually resulted in a wedding that felt more authentic to who we were as a couple. The emotional impact took longer to process and resolve. I found myself questioning other relationships in my life, wondering whether I had been naive about people's motivations or too trusting in situations where more caution might have been appropriate. The discovery that someone I loved had been systematically deceiving and exploiting me made it difficult to trust my own judgment about people's character and intentions. Therapy helped me understand that Jessica's betrayal said more about her than it did about me, and that the decision to trust family members wasn't a mistake even when that trust was sometimes violated. The alternative to trusting people was a kind of defensive isolation that would prevent me from forming meaningful relationships with anyone, and that would represent a different kind of damage to my life and happiness. The most unexpected outcome of the entire crisis was the way it strengthened my relationship with David and helped me understand what healthy family dynamics could look like. His family's response to our situation was supportive without being intrusive, offering help without trying to control the outcome, and expressing concern for both of us without taking sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Watching David's family navigate our crisis showed me what I had been missing in my own family relationships. They asked questions when they needed information but didn't demand access to private details. They offered practical support like help with wedding planning but didn't try to impose their preferences on our decisions. Most importantly, they trusted our judgment about what was best for our situation rather than trying to convince us to handle things differently. Our parents' progress in understanding their own role in the family dysfunction was slow but genuine. They began setting boundaries with Jessica that they had never established before, refusing to provide financial support without clear accountability measures and declining to intervene when she faced natural consequences for her choices. The changes were painful for them because they required abandoning parenting strategies that had been driven by love but had ultimately caused harm. Jessica's response to her new reality was entirely predictable. She blamed everyone else for her situation, claimed that the legal consequences were disproportionate to her crimes, and insisted that our family's refusal to support her unconditionally proved that we had never really loved her. She made no effort to understand why her behavior had been harmful or to develop strategies for making different choices in the future. The victim advocacy program I participated in during Jessica's legal proceedings connected me with other people who had been financially exploited by family members, and I was surprised to learn how common these situations were. Many of the other victims described years of manipulation and escalating demands for money, followed by dramatic confrontations when they finally set boundaries or involved law enforcement. Hearing other people's stories helped me understand that Jessica's behavior followed recognizable patterns that had nothing to do with unique family dynamics or personal failures on my part. The manipulation tactics she had used were standard approaches employed by people who exploited family relationships for financial gain, and my responses had been both normal and appropriate given the circumstances I was facing. The support group for family members of people with destructive behavior patterns provided additional perspective on the long-term process of recovery from relationships that had been damaged by manipulation and exploitation. Other participants shared strategies for rebuilding trust, setting appropriate boundaries, and maintaining family connections without enabling harmful behavior. One of the most valuable insights I gained was understanding the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive Jessica for the harm she had caused without rebuilding a relationship with her, and I could love her without accepting continued victimization. Forgiveness was about my own emotional healing, while reconciliation would require changes in her behavior that she showed no signs of making. The anniversary of Jessica's arrest came and went without any contact from her, though our parents reported that she was living in a different state and working in retail while trying to rebuild her life. The distance seemed appropriate for everyone involved, giving her space to develop independence without family support while protecting the rest of us from further manipulation or drama. My relationship with our parents continued to evolve as they worked to understand how their good intentions had contributed to years of family dysfunction. They were committed to learning healthier approaches to supporting their children, but the process was complicated by their grief over the loss of the relationship they had imagined having with Jessica and their guilt over the harm that had been caused to me. The wedding itself was beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with the expensive details I had originally planned. David and I exchanged vows surrounded by people who genuinely supported our relationship, in a celebration that reflected our values rather than social expectations or family pressures. The absence of Jessica was noticeable but not devastating, representing the end of a toxic relationship rather than the loss of something valuable. Standing at the altar in my replacement dress, looking at David and thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the crisis that had forced me to confront difficult truths about my family relationships. Jessica's theft had been devastating in the short term, but it had also freed me from patterns of enabling and victimization that would have continued causing damage for years if they had never been challenged. The most powerful realization was understanding that choosing my own well-being over family harmony wasn't selfish or vindictive. It was necessary for my emotional health and my ability to build healthy relationships with people who deserved my trust. Jessica had counted on my unwillingness to prioritize myself over family loyalty, and when that assumption proved wrong, her entire strategy for exploiting me collapsed. Wedding Fund Revenge Story Final Parts 10-14. The months following our wedding brought unexpected developments that proved Jessica's consequences were far more extensive than any of us had initially realized. Her criminal record created barriers to employment that she hadn't anticipated, and her pattern of burning bridges with friends and acquaintances left her with limited options for rebuilding her life. The comfortable safety net of family support that had cushioned her poor decisions for years was gone, forcing her to confront the reality of surviving on her own resources for the first time in her adult life. David and I received updates about Jessica's situation through our parents, who struggled with their new role as observers rather than rescuers in their daughter's life. They would call periodically to share news about her latest job or living situation, their voices carrying a mixture of concern and uncertainty about whether they were doing the right thing by maintaining their boundaries. The updates painted a picture of someone who was finally experiencing the natural consequences of years of irresponsible behavior, consequences that had been delayed but not eliminated by family intervention. Jessica had moved to Seattle shortly after her legal proceedings concluded, apparently believing that a change of location would provide a fresh start without the burden of her local reputation. But her criminal record followed her, making it difficult to secure decent housing or employment that matched her sense of what she deserved. The retail job she eventually found paid barely enough to cover basic living expenses, leaving no room for the lifestyle upgrades she had grown accustomed to funding through manipulation and theft. Her attempts to reconnect with old friends were largely unsuccessful, as word of her theft from me had spread through her social circle despite her efforts to control the narrative. The people who had once enabled her behavior by providing loans or covering expenses when she claimed to be in crisis were no longer willing to trust her with their money or their emotional support. The social network she had cultivated for financial exploitation had dried up, leaving her genuinely isolated for the first time since leaving home. The most revealing aspect of Jessica's new reality was how she responded to facing genuine hardship without family resources to fall back on. Instead of developing resilience or learning from her mistakes, she doubled down on the same patterns of thinking that had created her problems in the first place. She blamed our parents for abandoning her, blamed me for destroying her reputation, and blamed society for failing to give her adequate opportunities to succeed. Our parents shared with me a series of phone calls they had received from Jessica over several months, calls that demonstrated her complete inability to understand why her situation had deteriorated so dramatically. She continued to frame herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control, insisting that her theft of my wedding fund had been a desperate act by someone who had been driven to extremes by family neglect and societal unfairness. In one particularly revealing conversation, Jessica had demanded that our parents use their retirement savings to help her relocate to Los Angeles, where she believed she would have better opportunities to rebuild her life and pursue her creative interests. When they declined, explaining that they could no longer provide financial support without clear evidence of changed behavior, she accused them of choosing their own comfort over their daughter's well-being. The conversation highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Jessica's perception of her situation and the reality that everyone else could see clearly. She genuinely believed that she was entitled to family support regardless of her behavior, and that our parents' refusal to provide unlimited financial assistance constituted abandonment rather than appropriate boundary setting. The possibility that she might need to earn trust and support through changed behavior seemed completely foreign to her way of thinking. Our parents' growth in understanding healthy family dynamics was gradual but substantial. The counseling sessions they attended provided them with tools for supporting Jessica without enabling her destructive choices, but implementing those tools required constant vigilance against their natural instincts to rescue her from difficulty. They learned to express love and concern without automatically providing solutions to problems that Jessica needed to solve for herself. The most difficult aspect of their journey was accepting that their years of well-intentioned support had actually harmed Jessica by preventing her from developing the skills necessary to manage adult responsibilities independently. They had to confront the possibility that their love had been expressed in ways that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened their daughter, and that changing their approach might be the most loving thing they could do, even if it felt cruel in the short term. Their relationship with me deepened significantly as we worked together to understand how family dynamics had shaped all of our behaviors over the years. They began to appreciate the position I had been placed in as the family's reliable problem solver, and they understood for the first time how much pressure I had been carrying to maintain family stability while managing my own life and career responsibilities. Our conversations about Jessica became more honest and realistic, moving away from the careful optimism that had characterized family discussions for years toward a more balanced assessment of her actual behavior and likely prospects for change. Our parents learned to distinguish between hoping for Jessica's eventual growth and expecting immediate transformation, allowing them to maintain love for her without sacrificing their own well-being or mine. The wedding photos that David and I received several weeks after our ceremony captured something I hadn't expected to see in images from that day.
Despite all the trauma and conflict that had preceded our wedding, despite the theft and betrayal and family disruption, my face in those photographs showed genuine joy and peace rather than the anxiety and stress that had characterized my expressions in family photos for years. Looking at those images, I realized that Jessica's theft had accomplished something she had never intended. By forcing a final confrontation with family dysfunction, by creating a crisis so severe that it couldn't be minimized or explained away, she had actually freed me from patterns of behavior that had been limiting my happiness and personal growth for years. The woman in those wedding photos was someone who had learned to prioritize her own well-being without guilt or apology. David often commented on the changes he observed in me during the months following Jessica's arrest and our wedding. He said I seemed lighter, more confident in my own judgment, less anxious about family obligations, and more focused on building the life we wanted together. The constant background worry about Jessica's next crisis had been replaced by a calm awareness that her choices were her responsibility, not mine. Our first anniversary approached with none of the family drama that had characterized previous milestone events in my life. There were no emergency phone calls requiring immediate attention, no requests for financial assistance that would strain our budget, no emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for celebrating my own happiness. The absence of chaos felt almost surreal after years of managing constant family crises. Jessica's attempts to reconnect with our family intensified around the time of our anniversary, as if she had decided that enough time had passed for everyone to forgive and forget her crimes. She sent our parents a series of messages expressing regret for her past behavior and requesting an opportunity to rebuild family relationships, but her apologies focused more on the consequences she had faced than on the harm she had caused other people. The messages revealed that Jessica still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of trust and how it could be rebuilt after being damaged so severely. She seemed to believe that expressing regret was sufficient to restore family relationships, without acknowledging the need for sustained behavioral change or genuine accountability for her past actions. Her concept of making amends appeared to involve receiving forgiveness rather than earning it through demonstrated growth. Our parents forwarded me copies of Jessica's messages, asking for my perspective on whether she seemed genuinely committed to change or was simply seeking restoration of family support without accepting responsibility for why that support had been withdrawn. Reading her words, I was struck by how little self-awareness she demonstrated despite having had months to reflect on her situation and choices. Jessica's version of events still positioned her as someone who had been driven to desperation by family circumstances rather than someone who had made calculated decisions to exploit and manipulate people who loved her. She described her theft of my wedding fund as a moment of poor judgment rather than the culmination of years of escalating financial exploitation, and she framed her current difficulties as evidence of our family's cruelty rather than natural consequences of her own behavior. The most telling aspect of her messages was her assumption that family relationships could be restored to their previous state once everyone had moved past the unpleasantness of her legal proceedings. She showed no understanding that trust, once broken so completely, required extensive rebuilding efforts and that the old patterns of family interaction had been permanently altered by her choices. I advised our parents to respond with compassion but firmness, acknowledging Jessica's expressed desire to reconnect while maintaining the boundaries that protected everyone's well-being. They could express love for her without agreeing to resume financial support or emotional caretaking, and they could wish her well without accepting responsibility for solving her current problems. The conversation with our parents about how to respond to Jessica's outreach was one of many that demonstrated how much our family dynamics had evolved. Instead of automatic crisis management and immediate accommodation of Jessica's requests, we were able to have thoughtful discussions about what kinds of support might be genuinely helpful, versus what kinds would simply enable continued irresponsibility. Our parents ultimately decided to maintain limited contact with Jessica while holding firm on their boundaries around financial support and crisis intervention. They could love her and hope for her growth without sacrificing their own stability or returning to patterns of enabling that had proved harmful to everyone involved. The decision represented a healthy middle ground between complete estrangement and unlimited accommodation. Jessica's reaction to receiving love without financial support was predictably negative. She accused our parents of conditional love, claimed that real families supported each other unconditionally, and threatened to cut off all contact if they wouldn't provide the assistance she needed to rebuild her life properly. The threats revealed that she still viewed family relationships primarily as sources of material support rather than connections based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The ultimatum she delivered to our parents was almost identical to manipulation tactics she had used for years, but this time the threats didn't achieve their intended effect. Our parents had learned to distinguish between genuine need and manufactured crisis, between reasonable requests for support and attempts at emotional extortion. They maintained their boundaries despite Jessica's escalating demands and dramatic predictions about the consequences of their refusal to help. My own relationship with Jessica remained non-existent, and I had no interest in reopening communication with someone who had shown no genuine remorse for her crimes or understanding of why her behavior had been harmful. The theft of my wedding fund and destruction of my dress had been devastating enough, but her complete refusal to accept responsibility for those actions made any kind of reconciliation impossible to imagine. The peace that came from having clear boundaries with Jessica was something I hadn't experienced since childhood, before her manipulative patterns had fully developed. I could make decisions about my life and finances without worrying about how they might be exploited, could share good news without fearing that it would trigger requests for money, and could plan for the future without setting aside resources for Jessica's inevitable emergencies. David and I began discussing starting a family of our own, conversations that felt free from the anxiety that had previously accompanied thoughts about bringing children into our extended family situation. The prospect of raising children without exposing them to Jessica's manipulation and dysfunction felt like a gift that her criminal behavior had inadvertently provided. Our second anniversary arrived with news that Jessica had been arrested again, this time for check fraud in Seattle. The details were depressingly familiar. She had been writing bad checks to cover living expenses, apparently believing that she could manage the situation before the checks were processed. The pattern of escalating illegal behavior suggested that she had learned nothing from her previous legal troubles, and was continuing to view other people's money as available for her use. Our parents' reaction to Jessica's second arrest was markedly different from their response to her theft of my wedding fund. Instead of immediate panic and mobilization to provide legal and financial assistance, they expressed sadness but maintained their boundaries. They offered emotional support through phone calls but declined to provide money for legal fees or travel expenses to assist with her case. The difference in their response demonstrated how much they had learned about enabling versus supporting, and how clearly they now understood that their previous rescue efforts had prevented Jessica from facing the natural consequences that might have motivated genuine behavior change. They could love her without accepting responsibility for solving problems that she had created through her own choices. Jessica's second arrest also validated my decision to involve law enforcement in her theft of my wedding fund, rather than handling the situation as a private family matter. Her continued criminal behavior proved that family intervention and boundary setting alone would not have been sufficient to address her pattern of illegal financial exploitation. Only the formal consequences of the criminal justice system had any hope of motivating real change. The news of Jessica's latest legal troubles reached me through our parents, who were learning to share information without automatically requesting my involvement in problem-solving efforts. They understood that I had established clear boundaries around Jessica-related issues, and respected my choice to remain uninvolved in her ongoing difficulties. My response to learning about Jessica's second arrest was primarily relief that I was no longer in a position to be victimized by her escalating criminal behavior. If I had continued to enable her through financial support and family loyalty, I might well have been her target for this latest scheme. The boundaries I had established protected not only my financial resources, but also my emotional well-being and personal safety. The victim impact statement I had written for Jessica's original case had included predictions about her likely future behavior if she didn't receive meaningful consequences for her crimes. Her second arrest proved that those predictions had been accurate, validating my decision to press charges despite family pressure to handle the situation privately. David's family continued to provide a positive example of healthy family relationships that supported individual growth while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Watching his parents navigate various family challenges without drama or manipulation helped me understand what normal family dynamics looked like, and gave me hope for the kind of family environment we would create for our own children. The contrast between David's family and my family of origin was particularly stark during holiday celebrations, where his relatives managed to express love and support without creating crisis or requiring crisis management. Their gatherings were peaceful and genuinely enjoyable, focused on connection rather than problem-solving or emotional rescue operations. Our third anniversary brought the news that Jessica had been sentenced to jail time for her check fraud conviction, apparently having exhausted the patience of the Seattle criminal justice system with her repeat offenses and continued refusal to accept responsibility for her behavior. The sentence represented the first time in her adult life that she would face consequences that couldn't be minimized through family intervention or personal charm. Our parents' reaction to Jessica's incarceration was grief mixed with a kind of exhausted acceptance that this outcome had always been likely given her pattern of escalating illegal behavior. They had done everything they could to support her while maintaining healthy boundaries, but they couldn't control her choices or prevent her from facing the natural consequences of continued criminal activity. For me, Jessica's jail sentence represented the final confirmation that my decision to prioritize my own well-being over family harmony had been not only appropriate but necessary. If I had continued to enable her behavior through financial support and emotional accommodation, I would have been contributing to a pattern that ultimately led to more serious crimes and more severe consequences. The woman I had become through the process of setting boundaries with Jessica was someone I respected and appreciated in ways that wouldn't have been possible if I had continued to prioritize family peace over personal integrity. The theft of my wedding fund had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for personal growth that had improved every aspect of my life. As I write this story now, Jessica is serving her sentence, and our family has settled into new patterns of relationship that prioritize honesty and accountability over conflict avoidance and enabling. Our parents have rebuilt their financial security without the constant drain of Jessica's manufactured emergencies, and they've learned to find joy in family relationships that aren't defined by crisis management. David and I are expecting our first child, a development that feels possible and joyful in ways it wouldn't have if Jessica were still actively manipulating our family dynamics. Our child will grow up in an environment where love is expressed through appropriate support rather than unlimited accommodation, where family loyalty means holding each other accountable rather than covering up harmful behavior. The theft of my wedding fund was one of the most painful experiences of my life, but it was also the beginning of my transformation into someone who understands the difference between family loyalty and self-sacrifice. Jessica's betrayal taught me that protecting others from the consequences of their choices isn't love, it's enabling, and that real love sometimes requires allowing people to face difficulty in order to motivate genuine growth. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that Jessica's theft was both a crime and a gift. It was a crime that caused immediate trauma and financial damage, but it was also a gift that freed me from patterns of family dysfunction that had been limiting my happiness and personal development for years. The woman who was victimized by Jessica's theft was someone who had learned to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being. The woman who emerged from that experience was someone who understood that her own well-being was a prerequisite for healthy relationships with anyone. Jessica counted on my unwillingness to prioritize myself
over family harmony, and when that assumption proved wrong, her entire strategy for exploiting me collapsed. The boundaries I established in response to her theft protected not only my financial resources, but also my emotional health and my ability to build the life I wanted with David. The most important lesson I learned was that choosing my own well-being over family dysfunction wasn't selfish or vindictive. It was necessary for my personal growth and my ability to form healthy relationships with people who deserved my trust. Jessica's theft forced me to confront difficult truths about our family dynamics, truths that ultimately led to better relationships with the people who were capable of genuine love and mutual respect. Today, I am grateful for the crisis that taught me to value myself enough to demand better treatment from the people in my life. Jessica's betrayal was painful, but it was also the beginning of my journey toward understanding that real love doesn't require accepting abuse, and that family loyalty doesn't mean sacrificing personal integrity for the sake of keeping peace with people who haven't earned the right to that sacrifice. The decisive moment arrived when I made the call that would change everything. Not to the police, though that would come later, but to the one person Jessica never expected me to contact in this situation. My phone felt heavy in my hands as I dialed Tyler Brooks, Jessica's boyfriend of 8 months, the man she claimed was her soulmate, and the reason she needed financial stability to build a future with someone she truly loved. Tyler answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep but immediately alert when he heard the tension in my tone. I had only met him a few times at family gatherings, but he had always struck me as someone who genuinely cared about Jessica and believed in her potential for growth. He was hardworking, honest, and exactly the kind of stable influence our parents had been hoping would help Jessica mature into a more responsible adult. I told Tyler about the theft, about the destroyed wedding dress, about the security footage that proved Jessica's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. But more importantly, I told him about the envelope of cash she had claimed she needed to help him with his student loan payments, the emergency fund she had supposedly been building to surprise him with assistance for his financial struggles. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Tyler finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding that told me this wasn't the first time Jessica's financial claims had raised questions in his mind. He asked me to send him copies of the security footage and the timeline of events, not because he doubted my account but because he needed evidence to confront Jessica with facts she couldn't manipulate or explain away. Tyler's reaction was devastating in its quiet devastation. He told me that Jessica had indeed taken money from him over the past few weeks, claiming she needed cash for various emergencies while promising that her family would soon be providing financial support that would allow her to pay him back with interest. She had described me as someone who regularly gave her money for expenses, painting a picture of a generous sister who helped family members without question or judgment. The revelation that Jessica had been stealing from Tyler while simultaneously stealing from me created a pattern of behavior that was impossible to excuse or minimize. She wasn't just taking advantage of family relationships built on love and trust. She was systematically exploiting every person in her life who cared enough about her to offer financial assistance during what they believed were temporary difficulties. Tyler asked me what I planned to do with the evidence I had gathered, and I told him honestly that I was considering involving law enforcement but wanted him to have all the information before I made any final decisions. He deserved to know that the woman he loved had been lying to him about fundamental aspects of their relationship, including her reasons for needing money and her sources of financial support. His response surprised me with its clarity and strength. Tyler told me that he had been questioning Jessica's financial stories for weeks but had dismissed his doubts as paranoia or jealousy. He had seen inconsistencies between her claimed income and her spending patterns, had noticed that her emergencies always seemed to coincide with his own financial windfalls, and had begun to suspect that her requests for loans were less temporary than she had claimed. More importantly, Tyler had recently discovered that Jessica had been going through his personal belongings when he wasn't home, including his financial documents and correspondence with his student loan servicers. She had claimed she was trying to surprise him by researching ways to help with his debt, but the timing of her increased knowledge about his finances with her escalating requests for money had created suspicions he could no longer ignore. The conversation with Tyler lasted nearly 2 hours, during which we compared notes about Jessica's behavior patterns and began to understand the scope of her deception. She had been playing us against each other, using information gleaned from each relationship to make her lies more convincing in her dealings with others. My supposed generosity with family loans made her requests seem reasonable to Tyler, while his student debt struggles provided her with cover stories for why she needed money from me. Tyler's decision to break up with Jessica immediately wasn't driven by anger, but by a kind of exhausted recognition that their entire relationship had been built on lies that made genuine intimacy impossible. He had fallen in love with someone who didn't exist, a version of Jessica that she had carefully constructed to hide her exploitative and manipulative nature from someone she wanted to keep as a long-term resource. The breakup happened while Jessica was still at my apartment, trying to maintain her story about discovering evidence of a break-in while simultaneously deflecting my increasingly specific questions about the missing money. Tyler's arrival was unexpected and devastating to whatever strategy she had been developing to manage the crisis. His presence in my apartment, combined with his immediate confrontation about the money she had taken from him, created a situation Jessica couldn't control through her usual tactics of emotional manipulation and selective truth-telling. She was facing two people who had compared notes and could no longer be deceived by her carefully crafted narratives about family emergencies and financial hardships. Tyler's breakup speech was brief and devastatingly accurate. He told Jessica that he had fallen in love with honesty and authenticity, qualities that she had convincingly mimicked but apparently didn't actually possess. He said that discovering the extent of her deception had made him question not just their relationship but his own judgment about people's character and motivations. Jessica's reaction to Tyler's departure was the most authentic emotion I had seen from her all day. The tears that followed weren't calculated attempts to manipulate the situation, but genuine grief over losing someone she had apparently cared about despite her willingness to exploit him financially. For the first time, she was facing a consequence that couldn't be fixed through family intervention or personal charm. The loss of Tyler seemed to break something fundamental in Jessica's ability to maintain her victim narrative. Without him as an audience for her performance, without the possibility of salvaging their relationship through creative explanations or promised reforms, she was forced to confront the reality that her behavior had cost her something she actually valued. Her confession, when it finally came, wasn't the dramatic breakdown I had expected but a quiet acknowledgement of facts that had become impossible to deny. Jessica admitted to taking my money, to destroying my wedding dress, to lying about the break-in, and to manipulating Tyler for financial gain. But even in confession, she couldn't resist framing her actions as desperate responses to circumstances beyond her control rather than calculated choices driven by entitlement and lack of empathy. She claimed that the pressure of trying to maintain a relationship with Tyler while managing her own financial problems had driven her to desperate measures that she would never have considered under normal circumstances. According to Jessica, she had convinced herself that taking my wedding fund was borrowing rather than stealing, and that she would find a way to replace the money before I discovered it was missing. The explanation revealed the depth of Jessica's self-deception and her inability to understand how her actions affected other people. She genuinely seemed to believe that her intentions mattered more than the actual harm she had caused, and that her financial desperation justified violating the trust of people who loved her. Her destruction of my wedding dress, according to her account, had been an impulsive act of rage when she realized that the money she had stolen wouldn't be enough to solve her financial problems permanently. She had destroyed something that symbolized my happiness and stability because she felt overwhelmed by her own inability to achieve similar success through legitimate means. The psychological insight into Jessica's motivations was disturbing but also clarifying. She wasn't just financially irresponsible or impulsively criminal. She was someone who had developed a worldview in which other people's resources were available for her use whenever she felt sufficiently desperate or entitled. The destruction of my dress revealed an active hostility toward my success that went beyond simple financial need. Jessica's plea for understanding and forgiveness came with promises of complete behavioral change and offers to do whatever was necessary to make amends for her actions. But her promises felt hollow because they were accompanied by continued attempts to minimize the severity of what she had done and to position herself as someone who deserved sympathy rather than consequences. The conversation that followed her confession was one of the most painful experiences of my adult life, not because of what Jessica had done but because of what her actions revealed about the person I had been loving and supporting for years. The sister I thought I knew, the troubled but fundamentally good person I had been making excuses for, apparently didn't exist and never had. Jessica's manipulation had been so consistent and long-term that I had to question my memories of our childhood and adolescence, wondering which moments of apparent love and connection had been genuine and which had been calculated attempts to maintain my emotional investment in her well-being. The realization that someone I loved had been systematically deceiving me for years created a kind of existential crisis about my ability to judge people's character and motivations. The decision to involve law enforcement wasn't driven by vindictiveness, but by a recognition that Jessica's pattern of escalating criminal behavior wouldn't change without serious consequences that were beyond our family's ability to provide. She had already proven that family disapproval, relationship consequences, and financial hardship weren't sufficient deterrents to prevent her from exploiting people who trusted her. When the police arrived to take Jessica's statement and collect evidence, her demeanor shifted again toward the helpless victim persona that had been so effective with our parents over the years. She positioned herself as someone who had made mistakes under extreme duress, rather than someone who had committed calculated crimes against people who loved her. The officer's professional assessment of the evidence was swift and thorough. The security footage, the physical evidence of deliberately destroyed property, and Jessica's own confession created a case that would be difficult for any defense attorney to challenge successfully. Her theft of my wedding fund wasn't a family dispute but a clear case of larceny that had been planned and executed with deliberate intent to cause maximum financial and emotional damage. Jessica's arrest was handled with the same professional efficiency that characterized the entire investigation. She was read her rights, photographed, fingerprinted, and processed through the criminal justice system that had been designed to handle exactly this type of case. The family dynamics that had protected her from consequences for so long were irrelevant to law enforcement officers who dealt with financial exploitation cases on a regular basis. The aftermath of Jessica's arrest brought a kind of clarity to our family relationships that had been missing for years. Without her presence to deflect attention and create crisis, our parents and I were able to have honest conversations about patterns of behavior that had been obvious but unspoken for years. Our parents' initial reaction was predictable shock and attempts to minimize the severity of what had happened, but the evidence was too overwhelming and the consequences too serious for their usual protective strategies to be effective. They were forced to confront the reality that their daughter had committed serious crimes against her own sister, crimes that required legal rather than familial resolution. The most difficult aspect of the post-arrest period was watching our parents grapple with their own role in enabling Jessica's behavior over the years. They had to confront the possibility that their financial support and emotional protection had actually harmed Jessica by preventing her from learning to manage adult responsibilities independently. The family counseling sessions that followed were initially focused on crisis management and damage control, but they gradually evolved into more fundamental examinations of how we had all contributed to unhealthy patterns of interaction that had ultimately enabled Jessica's criminal behavior. Our parents learned about codependency and enabling, while I learned about setting appropriate boundaries and prioritizing my own well-being without guilt. The legal proceedings moved forward with the methodical pace of a criminal justice system that had handled thousands of similar cases. Jessica's public defender advised her to consider a plea agreement rather than going to trial, given the strength of the evidence against her and the likelihood that a jury would be unsympathetic to someone who had stolen from her own sister's wedding fund. The plea negotiations revealed additional information about Jessica's financial situation that our family had been unaware of. She had accumulated significant debt through credit cards and personal loans, had been evicted from previous apartments for non-payment of rent, and had been borrowing money from friends and coworkers with no realistic ability to repay those debts. The $40,000 she had stolen from me was only a fraction of the money she owed to various creditors, and her plan for using my wedding fund apparently involved paying off some of her most pressing debts while buying time to develop longer-term strategies for financial survival. The theft hadn't been an impulsive act of desperation, but a calculated decision to prioritize her own financial problems over my wedding plans. Jessica's sentencing hearing provided an opportunity for me to deliver a victim impact statement that articulated not just the immediate damage caused by her theft, but the longer-term effects of discovering that someone I loved had been systematically deceiving and exploiting me for years. Writing that statement forced me to confront the full scope of how Jessica's behavior had affected my life and relationships. The statement I delivered to the court focused on the violation of trust that had occurred when Jessica chose to steal my wedding fund rather than asking for help or acknowledging her financial problems honestly. I described the years of financial support our family had provided, the pattern of manufactured emergencies that had required constant crisis management, and the emotional toll of trying to maintain a loving relationship with someone who was actively exploiting that love for financial gain. Jessica's response to my victim impact statement was consistent with her historical pattern of deflecting responsibility and positioning herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. Even facing formal criminal consequences, she continued to frame her theft as a desperate act by someone who had been failed by family members who should have been more supportive of her struggles. The judge's sentencing remarks indicated a clear understanding of the dynamics involved in family financial exploitation cases and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable regardless of their relationships with their victims. Jessica received a sentence that included restitution, community service, and probation, along with requirements for financial counseling and regular check-ins with a probation officer. The restitution order required Jessica to repay the $40,000 she had stolen, though her financial situation made it unclear whether she would ever be able to fulfill that obligation completely. The more important consequence was the creation of a formal legal record that would make it difficult for her to exploit future victims through similar schemes. The community service requirement was specifically designed to help Jessica understand the impact of her behavior on other people and to develop empathy for victims of financial crimes. The probation conditions included restrictions on her access to other people's financial information and requirements for transparency about her own financial activities. The months following Jessica's sentencing brought a kind of peace to our family relationships that I hadn't experienced since childhood. Without the constant background worry about Jessica's next crisis or financial emergency, our parents and I were able to develop more authentic connections based on mutual interests and genuine affection, rather than crisis management and problem solving. My wedding to David proceeded with a different kind of energy than I had originally planned. Instead of the anxious perfectionism that had characterized my earlier approach to wedding planning, I found myself focused on what really mattered, celebrating our commitment to each other surrounded by people who genuinely supported our relationship. The replacement dress I chose was simpler but more meaningful than the original, selected for how it made me feel rather than how it would look in photographs. The financial adjustments required by Jessica's theft actually resulted in a more authentic celebration that better reflected David's and my values and priorities as a couple. The guest list for our wedding was revised to reflect the new reality of our family relationships. Jessica would not be attending, obviously, but the decision about whether to include our parents was more complex. They had supported my decision to press charges and were working to understand their role in enabling Jessica's behavior, but rebuilding trust would require time and consistent demonstration of changed priorities.
Our parents' attendance at our wedding represented their commitment to prioritizing healthy family relationships over their historical pattern of accommodating Jessica's dysfunction. Their presence felt genuine rather than obligatory, and their participation in our celebration wasn't overshadowed by worry about managing potential drama or crisis. The most unexpected outcome of the entire crisis was discovering how much stronger my relationship with David had become through the process of dealing with Jessica's betrayal and its aftermath. Instead of being frightened away by family drama or concerned about my vindictive response to being victimized, David was impressed by my strength in refusing to accept abuse and my commitment to holding people accountable for their behavior. His support throughout the crisis helped me understand that the qualities Jessica had attacked as evidence of my unworthiness for love were actually the qualities that made me a good partner and a strong person. My careful planning, my documentation of problems, and my willingness to set boundaries were signs of emotional health rather than dysfunction. The anniversary of Jessica's arrest came and went without incident, marking a full year of family life without manufactured emergencies or requests for financial crisis intervention. The absence of drama felt almost surreal after years of managing constant family problems, and the peace allowed me to focus on building the life David and I wanted together. Jessica's progress during her probation period was reported to our parents through official channels, but she had no direct contact with any of us during her court-supervised rehabilitation process. The reports indicated that she was working in retail, living in a supervised housing arrangement, and participating in required counseling sessions, but there was no indication that she had developed genuine insight into how her behavior had affected other people. The most significant personal growth I experienced during this period was learning to trust my own judgment about people's character and motivations. Jessica's betrayal had initially made me question my ability to recognize deception and manipulation, but I came to understand that her skill at deception said more about her than it did about my naivety. The therapeutic work I did during the months following Jessica's arrest helped me understand the difference between healthy family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. I learned that protecting people from the natural consequences of their choices isn't love but rather a form of control that prevents genuine growth and accountability. The most important lesson I learned was that choosing my own well-being over family dysfunction wasn't selfish or vindictive but necessary for my emotional health and my ability to form healthy relationships with people who deserved my trust. Jessica's theft had forced me to confront difficult truths about our family dynamics, truths that ultimately led to better relationships with people who were capable of genuine love and mutual respect. Today, as I reflect on everything that happened, I realize that Jessica's theft of my wedding fund was both the most painful and the most liberating experience of my adult life. It was painful because it forced me to accept that someone I loved had been systematically deceiving and exploiting me for years. It was liberating because it freed me from patterns of family dysfunction that had been limiting my happiness and personal growth. The woman who was victimized by Jessica's theft was someone who had learned to prioritize other people's comfort over her own well-being, someone who accepted being treated poorly in the name of family loyalty. The woman who emerged from that experience was someone who understood that her own well-being was a prerequisite for healthy relationships with anyone. Jessica counted on my unwillingness to prioritize myself over family harmony, and when that assumption proved wrong, her entire strategy for exploiting me collapsed. The boundaries I established in response to her theft protected not only my financial resources, but also my emotional health and my ability to build the life I wanted with David. The theft of my wedding fund taught me that real love doesn't require accepting abuse, and that family loyalty doesn't mean sacrificing personal integrity for the sake of keeping peace with people who haven't earned the right to that sacrifice. Jessica's betrayal was devastating, but it was also the beginning of my journey toward understanding that I deserved to be treated with respect and honesty by the people in my life. The most profound realization was that Jessica's actions, while criminal and hurtful, had actually given me a gift I hadn't known I needed. By forcing a final confrontation with family dysfunction, by creating a crisis so severe that it couldn't be minimized or explained away, she had freed me from patterns of behavior that had been holding me back from genuine happiness and authentic relationships. Looking at my life now, surrounded by people who treat me with respect and honesty, building a future with someone who values my strength rather than exploiting my loyalty, I am grateful for the crisis that taught me to value myself enough to demand better treatment from everyone in my life. Jessica's theft was supposed to destroy my wedding and damage my relationship with David. Instead, it taught me who I really was and what I was truly capable of when I finally decided to prioritize my own well-being over family peace. The woman who emerged from that crisis was stronger, wiser, and more authentic than the woman who had been victimized, and for that transformation, I will always be grateful. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.